They're like, this globe ought to work.
Yeah, exactly. These things, I mean, we got is more than 10 years ago in the middle of
Really?
nowhere, Tennessee. We had some friends that were at Murray State and there was some antiquing going on. And it was just one of those things we had to keep moving for no good reason. They're heavy,
Turkeys out.
expensive, but we're like, we got them, we're moving them. And we moved 7, 8 times across a few different states on that whole trying to finish up grad school and get gainful employment kind of thing. But these globes have made the trip every time. Not always made it up on the wall every time, but they've always made the trip.
They've earned to stay. They've earned their place, adding to the feng shui for sure. I mean, I'm in the middle of relocating from like California, like Riverside, LA area to Las Vegas, really in the Henderson area. And tried the first time last week and that didn't go so well. So take two, still in limbo right now. It's a whole long, arduous
moving in COVID is enough, but what you experienced was.
Yeah, but I'm happy to, eventually we'll call Henderson the fight capital of the world, like my home, and be in that backyard and stuff.
Yeah.
So
very cool.
Excited for that. And I'm teaching online right now at Fielding Graduate University in the psych department. So being able to do the remote stuff and still be in fight capital and be a part of that culture and stuff I'm certainly excited about it. I'm looking forward to, expanding all these opportunities,
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, I know we'll certainly talk about a bunch of it here and we'll go. Do you have a hard stop at any time? I always like to know.
Nope, not me. The tiny humans are in bed, and so I'm good for the foreseeable. This is when we normally start working. Now that we don't have office hours and we can't really escape. It's like they're down. How much can we get done?
I know.
Well, if there's a toddler run in, it's acceptable.
Okay.
If you're playing like a bingo, by the way, we're on YouTube live now.
Okay.
And I tagged you guys if you guys wanted to send the link out. But thank you. And so we'll start. And can I ask you, how old are your humans?
I've got a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. So we were just finishing up 2nd grade and kindergarten this week.
Wow. That is amazing. I can give you are doing our service for our country. Because I have a 15-year-old and that's hard. And like she can feed herself. She can sit and, on her computer, where I was telling people if I had to have like story, like all you do in kindergarten is circle time, right? You learn to sit around.
You just learn the rules of society.
Rules of society. And now you're having to enforce them. The dad, enforcer, the teacher, the nap, everything.
Yeah, the girls had great teachers this year, and they are not satisfied with their replacements since we went remote. That's for sure.
I know. And then, you are also camp counselor now if school is over. So.
Yes. Yeah, we used to have right from school to dance class was like a pipeline of someone looked after them, and I just had to chauffeur them and some friends, and then someone else looked after them. And now all of a sudden, there's no good cop, bad cop. It's just bad cop all the time. All the time. You can't win. But
you know what? And we're going to get into this. All of this generation, I think they're going through adversity. Mm-hmm. I'm telling everyone, like we talk about other generations who've gone through wars or depressions, and these kids, not only will they know they got through something, will they appreciate getting away from mom and dad, going to dance class, going to a movie will be unbelievable. So, we got to think about that.
Yes, I'll be really curious to see what their memories are like, when you think about it 10 years down the road, what sticks out and what they entirely forgot that is, really vivid for me, I'm sure.
No, and as a historian, that sometimes we think in the moment this will change our lives forever, but sometimes it does, or sometimes we have short memories. So it'll be interesting. Well, thank you. It is June 9th, Tuesday, and 2020. And tonight is the first boxing match after the COVID coronavirus pandemic. We have fights. Top Rank is on ESPN, headed up by Bob Arum. We have 5 fights tonight. You'll like this, Andrew. We were trying to figure out how many rounds each of them are. We made the mistake of looking at the betting odds. Woo! Yeah. Boxing. I didn't know you could be in the thousands of in terms of. But we do have an interesting fight. We lost the Michaela Mayer. I think that was Joseph, wherever on my list, which I was really excited about because I think she's really an interesting person for women in boxing. We've talked
Right.
about the gender and combat sports, how women in MMA seem to have transcended in terms of really being part of the sport. It was a younger, culture that they broke into, where women's boxing has always seemed to, that they're a side act. Clarissa Shields is changing that.
Right. Yeah. There was the Layla Ali sort of moment,
Yes.
and there wasn't that inertia behind her.
Yeah.
It feels like, to keep it going, but she is also still around, as we are well aware.
I know. Do you think that fight would ever happen?
In the sport of boxing, there is literally no impossible, right?
Yeah, never say never, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I
Yeah.
love seeing they're even back and forth between, on ESPN at various different shows, like, well, shit, if she wants to come up, what, and just doing I love that. That's what I think, that's the type of energy, that can be, that women's boxing can afford to use to, to help the momentum and getting attention there. That's huge.
Absolutely. It comes down to getting the spot on TV, right? The accessible channels at the appropriate times, or the big pay-per-view events. And it takes those kinds of personalities above all else to get that opportunity.
That's key, the personalities. And then that it's coming from an authentic place too, and it's not forced, because per your point, that Layla Ali was obviously from the family lineage, and then also just dominating performance in her time, to now seeing Clarissa Shields have that shine a little bit. Now it's almost like she probably sees herself in that. And so it's a natural story that just is writing itself in front of us. It's like, okay, are you really going to take this throne that I have been holding this entire time? So it's writing itself, and it's like, okay, it has to happen eventually, where it's, the young buck, versus the legend. So I hope it happens. Or per your point, like never say never kind of in boxing. And I think it's just a matter of dollars and time.
Absolutely.
Andrew, I'm going to get you, and we're going to also introduce you and everything.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's actually a great segue, because Foreman versus Holyfield, was a type of this person coming back after 10 years, older, and that they made that fight. I was just watching some clips about it. I've forgotten, Foreman comes out with the tray of hamburgers. So, but they made it happen, and it's kind of this, he came back. But actually, before I introduce you, we actually need to address something. We did this panel on Muhammad Ali's anniversary of his death last Wednesday. And we were about 4 minutes from being done, and we were Zoom bombed.
I heard, yeah.
Yes, I know. I hope you haven't experienced this.
I have not, but I had pretty small classes, and links were only ever in the course management system. And this, we were only doing that for the last 6 weeks of the semester. So my exposure was limited. No one was trying to force their way into, the sport management seminar or the liberal arts capstone, unless they were literally forced to be in that room. So,
well, good.
But we, even at my small college, we've had that in other classes. And it's something that no one, I think, foresaw until we all ended up on Zoom.
Yeah, no, exactly. So it was my first experience with it. And what happened was all of a sudden our room had about 30 more people on there, and they started, saying racial slurs and had some images. And so I told Anisha, I was like, I wish I had combat training in Zoom where I knew how to get them off or do something, but I just had to really end it. And, I want to ask Tanisha how you felt. For me, it just was so sad, because we're almost at the end. We're going to wrap up, and, to understand that people came here with the goal of a thoughtful discussion on Ali and what he meant, and even going into what the reframing of his image has been in terms of has his activism been lost because of people wanting to and so maybe corporate America wanting to make him more palatable. And it was really interesting to think about what he meant and how he really thought about being Black and how that was powerful. So we didn't get to have that moment very well. If you can go, please, we're going to put the link out again, Tanisha, remind people to say, because you can see it. We do come back just to wrap up. Mm-hmm. But it was disturbing. However, our legal team is working with Zoom to investigate it as a hate crime.
Yeah.
And we just want to let you know that Andrew, we will keep you secure as much as possible. We had some extra security on here. And if anyone else tries it again, I'm like looking out, I don't know where.
You're like, right.
Not going to push me down. I'm just going to fight harder. So I just want to let that know that we have our legal team on call. So
That's good. That's good. We're all going to learn from the first go around with remote teaching in mass, right? So
exactly.
Yeah.
Do you
No,
have
absolutely.
anything to say?
Yeah, just echoing what you said, and I think what you mentioned too, Andrew, was that this is an unprecedented time where like literally everybody was thrown into this, right? And using this platform.
Yeah.
Sure, there are some alternatives that are coming up that can facilitate these type of things and be that conduit for virtual conversations. But I mean, just in terms of like what that meant was, I mean, it was crushing. It was a punch in the gut because there was so much positive momentum and excitement between, Nancy and I and the other panelists that were on there, because this was a great opportunity, of using the current climate of being able to look at it from a historical perspective of how Ali's legacy might be able to glean some insight from that. What would he have done? What he meant, what it continues to mean for this. And so fortunately, yeah, it happened like 90% when we were already almost done, right? Yeah. But it still doesn't hurt any less. It always sucks. It wasn't the first time I've been called that. I'm positive it won't be the last, in person or virtually, social media, because there's always those, Nancy, as I've coined, thumb thugs that will just be there and completely, say whatever the hell they think they want, because they hide in their mom's basement or whatever. But
it's the anonymity of the interwebs, definitely.
Absolutely. You get the extremes of both. You get the great, the bad, the positive, the negative, and everything kind of in between. And so I went dark for like a week and just had to like turn off social media, just had to like, all right, I need to refresh. I just need to breathe. I need to exhale. I was already exhausted. This just made it a little worse.
Absolutely.
And I reached out to some friends and heard a lot of different things. Like, well, I'm sure it was just kids, and it's like that doesn't make it any better, in my opinion. But
it doesn't. But I'm gonna tell you what. I mean, it's really authentic to a conversation about Muhammad Ali. We haven't got over all of the things that he railed against. We haven't completely glossed over some of the things that he did wrong. So I guess it's fitting that someone would Zoom bomb a conversation about Ali because we aren't done with him yet.
And it means we're saying
wherever he is, we're not done with him yet.
Right. And we're saying the right things. We're having the right conversations because they felt that the need to disrupt it. And we won't stop. We're not stopping. We won't be disrupted. And obviously this is our first one back afterwards. And there's already several more in the pipeline that we're getting ready to produce and stuff. So yeah, just with that, they can keep trying, but we'll stick around because I think the rest of the world is watching and know that this can be a benchmark moment for everyone's history.
Definitely.
Well, thank you, Tanisha. Thank you. And it's been trying on so many angles these last couple of weeks. So it's so understandable. And Andrew, thank you for your perspective too. I really appreciate it because I know history and that what the context is. So now let's get into Professor Smith here and talk some boxing and talk Foreman. I've been on a Foreman kick. Like Tanisha, like I'm back and reading your book.
It's a deep rabbit hole once you go down.
It is.
So many lives, so many personalities, and
just such a long public career. I mean, not that many people are in the public eye for more than half a century.
I know. All right. Well, we welcome to our academic panel here, Professor Andrew R.M. Smith, originally from Ontario. Okay, the town
Guelph. Yep.
Guelph. Oh, I love that. Guelph. Never have heard of it, but now you will always be attached to it to me.
It's about an hour west of Toronto. If Teresa Runstedler is still at American University, so she's from Kitchener, which is like the next town over, which is slightly bigger and better known.
Now I'll tell her that I know about. So Kitchener is the bigger one.
Yep.
She out-golfs Guelph.
She does. Yes, definitely.
So you majored in history at Acadia University. Where you said massive failures in your bio on the football field and indoor track, but please, you were a collegiate athlete. That's more than I can say. Where you earned your BA and won the A.H. McLean Award for Best Honors Thesis on a riveting analysis of the Dixie Mason and America's Cold War foreign policies. Wow. And then you went on to go to Purdue University. My brother went to Purdue, so I always have that in sports history, where you completed your MA and PhD in U.S. history, focusing in particular on sport, race, and the American experience. Afterwards, you joined the faculty at Nichols College, which is in what was the name of Massachusetts?
Dudley, Massachusetts.
Dudley, where you were an assistant professor of sports management and history. And you teach across the curriculum, where you fuse past, present, and future of American sports relationship to people in and outside the sporters. And your first book, which I have right here, everyone go and get it. I'll put the Amazon link on there. No Way But to Fight, George Foreman in the Business of Boxing, where you historicize, globalize, and contextualize the life and career of the Olympic gold medalist and two-time heavyweight champion, George Foreman, which is not easy, as we say, because of his long life, multiple careers, re-emerging, souls. I mean, he decides to give up boxing, doesn't even shadow box for 10 years to become a preacher, evangelist. I'm saying that right. I need some more caffeine here.
There is not enough for these times.
All right. Well, I actually kind of want to go to your story first, Andrew.
Sure.
Sports and history. Like what drew you down that path?
Serendipity, really. I grew up single mom with a brother in community housing for the first little while. So sports was really the outlet. It was the best part of any day, the sports that we could play. Football was pretty cheap in my town, so that was a good option. And so sports had just really sort of been the centrifugal force of my entire life. It's why I wanted to go to school. I went to school because I knew I'd get to practice or play later that day. And if it weren't for sports, I probably wouldn't have gone to a lot of school. There were a lot of classes maybe I didn't go to because I was just waiting for practice, So I didn't think a whole lot about higher education necessarily until I started getting some attention near the end of my high school career and started thinking maybe I could play college football. And it turns out I really couldn't, but I tried anyway. But that got me into a school. I went there, I think, probably because it was the most competitive team to treat me the nicest. But in reality, it was a small school, a good faculty, a great place to really dive into a subject and get to know professionals and practitioners. So I got a really good history education. But I didn't think much about sports as history. I was doing diplomatic history. That thesis, was about foreign service officers who went to the communist capital in China during the Second World War. And that's why no one's ever written about it, because it's dry. We're not going to pull any punches here. And so I wasn't sure how I was going to translate that into graduate school, but I was starting to think that maybe I wanted to teach and write history. And just that last semester, like a lot of people, I only needed a couple classes to graduate, but I had to take at least one more to keep a scholarship. So, okay, what's on the books? What can I do? And there's this sport history class in the kinesiology program. And I was certainly not a kinesiologist. Don't even think I could have pronounced it at the time, so I'd never thought about this class. And now I'm a senior and I have a decent GPA. And so I write the appropriate emails and they say, okay, sure, you can take this class. And it just opened my eyes and it said, I can take history and the tools and the methods that I've learned, but I can use sports, which is the one thing that I do know well. Yeah, I didn't know diplomacy super well. I didn't speak Chinese to be writing, an in-depth project of foreign service officers in China, but I knew sports. Mm-hmm. And so when I read those kinds of books and I thought about those themes, I mean, that was just, it was like the light bulb went off and I said, this is how I can make a difference. And this is how I can use my life story, not just my short academic collegiate career, but my life story to really add to the literature,
Yeah. No, for me too, I think that what I love about combining kind of like an inquiry, a study with sports is that you can learn about life and you can dive in through it because I think it reflects and it affects our society. And so I love that. And it's also sounds like you had a passion. I mean, it said it brought you to school and, gave you, so was it football? Then you also
So
attract.
this is the irony, is that, football was the sport, is still the sport that was closest to me, but college, grinding for a couple of years and not getting any playing time and finally getting some playing time, and then a coaching change and head injuries and I stopped playing. There was sort of a love-hate relationship with football, and I still would find it difficult, I think, to research and write about football. But in that sport history class, when I started reading about boxing, I said, these are the stories. I mean, the stories of American history were so vivid. I'd already gravitated, I think, to US history, which I had never really thought about much before, even though both my grandmothers were American. So I had lots of American family and I'd crossed the border plenty of times. I hadn't thought much about American history until college, when I started thinking about, this disconnect between the great experiment, where all men are created equal, given that 18th century, we didn't think much beyond those terms of just men, but all men are created equal except the ones that are enslaved. And it blew my mind. I mean, I needed to try and dig down and figure out the antecedents, the reasons, the legacies of that fundamental disconnect. Boxing made that so clear because those stories were literally black and white, and every story inside of a ring had to be blown up to a promotion outside of those ropes, to sell tickets. That it just says so much about American society at different points in time along the way. That as soon as I started thinking about boxing as history, I knew this was the way that I could tell those stories. I could read the stories, I could relate those stories, because it's just so unique in global sports.
Yeah.
It's huge. I love that. And it just reminds me of all of the cultural ways that this intersects with not just even American history, but global history. And we know how boxing and wrestling has been, already historically linked as like, these are the first recognized sports, right? In like ancient history. And then seeing how, Black athletes, Black combat sport is obviously just like looked at as a marvel and a prop as opposed to like human beings, because even at the time, like you said, we were still slaves, like owned by others. So it was literally just there for elitist entertainment, and ways to do that. And so it's funny because similarly, I, grew up playing sports, big sports fan, played a little in college. And as I'm using that as an excuse to, get a higher education and studying that at the doctoral level. And it's like, I have friends that this day ask me, like, why do you watch sports so much? Like, don't you see it as just a revisionist plantation, like the NCAA, college basketball, football, like all of this stuff? And how could you still watch NFL when you see what they did to Colin? Like, what the hell? Like, don't you know, like this? And so I get all of that. And it reminds me of like what we touched upon a little bit last week when we were talking about Ali, is that I don't get a lot of avenues where I can see people that look like me succeed. Literally sports is where I can only get that. It's sports and entertainment. And a lot of people over the last few weeks, because of the protests and stuff, have been saying, I wish America loved Black people the way they love Black culture. And where sports and entertainment is literally embedded within those fabrics of sports and entertainment. And so, and when you look at the Black boxer, the Black athlete, how that's something just to be marveled at, and they're no longer a character within their own story. They're no longer human, because literally we weren't considered, we were 3/5, And
Yep.
so, and Ali was just such a legacy, like example of Black pride and Black beauty. And even like the funny quotes that he would say was like, like, I'm too pretty. The only way you could lick me is if I was a stamp or something like that. Like, like all these lines about that. And it was just great way that other people can rejoice and be proud of who they are. And so, and as a sports fan, it's like, yes, I love competition. Yes, I grew up playing. Like, yes, I like the distractionary aspects of it. But also, where else am I going to see folks like me succeed?
Mhm.
And that's why, like, I didn't watch tennis before Serena and Venus.
Yep.
I didn't watch one hole of golf before Tiger Woods. I couldn't
Yep,
tell you what a birdie was.
absolutely.
I was like, you mean that little bitch that keep yelling at one? Like, I had no idea what this stuff was. So there's such an example that they have using those platforms of athletics and competition and physique that I know has such generational and centuries worth of lineage, and it goes back to like the Jack Johnsons and everything even before that, and the names of folks that we don't know. And so
Yeah.
it's interesting hearing about the stories of like Ali and even Foreman and Holyfield, uh, Tommy Hearns, like all these guys, because they all have different, I'm sure, perspectives of how they want to use their platform. Because you have folks like Jordan who couldn't give a shit,
Yep.
right? At the time, until very recently, he donates a lot of money, right? So
Sure.
it's interesting about how all of this can intersect between sports and society. You would be willfully ignorant to think that it's not completely important to understand that in the context of U.S. history.
Absolutely. And it's great when those moments we have like Foreman and Frazier and Ali, and you've got a few people at the top of one sport that are interacting with each other and bringing such different experiences, even of Blackness, because different areas, rural versus urban, South versus North versus Midwest, migration, out of state migration, in state, and how it just changes the way that they see the world. And when they get in front of each other, the rest of the country and the rest of the world really needs to recognize, oh, it's not a monolithic culture. There are different people with different experiences, even with melanin in their skin cells.
Yes.
And that's why that rivalry was so good, because they were legitimately very different people.
Yes. Those rivalries are great. And I think William Roden, wrote that amazing book, like $40 Million Slaves, and about the rise and fall of like the Black athlete and the redemption of such. And it's something that, it makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, it's like, well, damn, I love these stories, these feuds, these natural ways of just wanting to see the sport of itself when you can remove all of the outside contamination of it, right? From like politics, economics, and all that stuff, when you can just look at it for the sport. And that's why I think it's so great when you see true, authentic, just athletes come out of that. And I think Foreman is included in that, and these legacy feuds that he's had, when you can just look at the sport of boxing in and of itself and just even rejoice in that as two competitors and remove all of the noise.
Mm-hmm.
This is a great segue too, because to talk about Foreman, and you mentioned authenticity, but if you look at the many versions of Foreman, did he finally come to the true Foreman, or was he always growing? And I ask this because I'm curious why you thought it was important, because you title this, The Business of Boxing, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if you're using him because he typifies certain avenues for boxers. And I mentioned to you, about coming from a low income, and I mentioned this, that the day that we have George Floyd passing, and we're celebrating his funeral I think he's in the 3rd district of Houston, whereas Foreman grew up in the 5th district, where, I think I've never heard the term, and I think I read it in your book, called shotgun houses. And that's like, that kind of just, very tightly dense, but not kept up well. And you mentioned this, how he was literally hungry.
Yep.
Literally hungry. Can you tell me, I guess, just about Foreman and why you chose him, and about maybe his beginning, that first Foreman?
Sure. So the earliest memories of Foreman and the stuff about his early life was actually the information that I got almost the latest, because that's what I really had to get from him. I had done a lot of print research, and I consciously, and I'm not sure it was the right way or not, but I consciously left interviews until after the dissertation, part of the book revisions, really late. I wanted to know the whole story as it was unfolding in print before I went to oral history, because that's not my strong suit. So that's the stuff that I learned really more towards the end. But it was fascinating. Yeah, I mean, he's remembering the shotgun house of his grandparents in Marshall. They were sharecroppers, which means obviously they were not too far removed from outright slavery. And so their house, he said you could shoot a shotgun through it and you wouldn't hit anything because there's no plumbing, there's no wiring, no electricity, no water, no nothing. There's a rectangle with a roof over it. You know, his mom makes a difficult choice, like so many women did at that time, to leave that area and go to the closest urban center. Not everyone could afford to take their family, to Detroit or to Chicago or to New York, right? But because of her husband's new job, they could at least get passage on the railroad, even though the marriage was already in trouble. They could get free tickets on the rail line and get from Marshall to Houston. She had some sisters already there. They could kind of use that kinship network to restart in a city. And, a short order cook at least had some regular wages that were her own, whereas we know sharecropping was a system set up to make you fail and to live to cyclical indebtedness, right? So there was an opportunity. And the way he remembers it, though, is, big wages and indoor toilets. I mean, that's what they were focused on, this move to the city. But then he ends up in the Fifth Ward. George Floyd from the Third Ward is a little bit different in the sense that the Third Ward was really the Black commercial capital of Houston, almost until the interstate system dissects it from the other predominantly Black wards. The ward system is now defunct, but that's sort of how they're even still kind of remembered. And so the Third Ward, it's almost a more precipitous fall. The folks that were there tended to be the people of color with more money and more cachet, and then it falls hard within a generation, right? Whereas the Fifth Ward had almost always been the place where those with the least settled in the closest quarters with whatever they could get. And his family really was one of those, where housing was not guaranteed. He said they would move every 3 or 4 months. Maybe they couldn't pay the rent. Maybe the place wasn't worth paying rent for. They would go. But a lot of the houses looked the same and they weren't far from each other, and he was honestly hungry all the time. And that's something that is, certainly not an outlier even in the 21st century. Kids in urban areas who are literally hungry all day long. And you think, well, why can't they do better in school? And they say, well, because they're hungry or they're tired or they're both. How well do we function if we miss lunch because the meeting went long or we don't get a lot of sleep, the night before class? So he's really, like millions of other people whose names we don't know, he is set up to fail. I mean, he is up against it from day one and he hadn't done anything wrong yet. And then he would start doing things wrong and then he's even more behind the curve. So it really is an escape shoot that he happened to come of age during the Great Society, which was a blink in the moment of American history, where there was enough support from enough folks in and out of government to say, yeah, we need to invest in people who need help. And that's going to bring everyone up. And so he gets this pass out of Houston. He didn't know how far out of Houston he was going to go, but he still did it, because he even understood at that point, anywhere is better than here. Any chance better than this where I don't have much chance.
And so then it just shows you too, I mean, the Great Migration, and he encapsulates that the hardship, but even though having indoor plumbing and a constant wage was doing better. And I guess, Tanisha, can you also maybe chime in here, because I'm very curious, is this idea of Black Americans where it's fighting, sometimes it was his ticket out, as you say. And you were saying, Tanisha, that options are limited.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was some research I did along the way in getting my doctorate in developmental basis of behavior, and they're for looking at minority youth, particularly young Black men, young Black boys, children, K through 12. There is a heavy emphasis on athletics over academics because there is that way of looking at it as a way out. And there's so much more pressure that is put on young Black men, specifically as with extra stigmas of needing to be the breadwinner, support your family, make the money by any means necessary, you know, and give back to your family. And if you can't rap, you better dribble. I mean, we see these all the time, and these narratives and these stigmas and stereotypes. It's like, well, you better do one or the other, you know? And so there is just that heavy undertone of athletics over academics. And quite honestly, too, because of the marginalized communities and Section 8 projects, and literally why they're called projects is because it was nothing but just a box check for like a government system to earn some more money. And then it's like, yeah, fine, we'll just put this box here, call it a project, and there, now we can get some more funding when none of those resources actually being allocated to said neighborhood. So there's naturally now going to be violence and fighting for basic resources and just common area living. And so fighting, boxing just becomes something that unfortunately a lot of young Black men specifically learn early. And so doing that, it becomes a way out. It looks like it's the only way out, and that it becomes an option that is the most reinforced also by the poor teachers and educations in these public school systems, where we know time and resources that are separated between a busy classroom, it's only going to be spent or divvied up in a certain way, and not really always monitoring those that may need the more attention. Per your point, if you're hungry, shit, if I haven't had my second coffee today and I'm already slipping, right? And so it's like, you can't imagine if a kid hasn't had their food, like a full meal. I mean, that's why even going on right now, we know that a lot of programs are starting to, you know, find funding to create lunches for kids because they're not in school right now, and that was their only guaranteed meal. Mm-hmm. And so in putting that in these types of looking at specifically just the Black community and fighting, it's real. It's a very real thing that's just getting even more amplified now because of limited resources and a stigma and stereotypes of it's athletics over academics, rap music, dribble, run fast, punch hard, and because no one else has presented them an alternative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and thank you, Tanisha. It's so important to talk about this. And I want to, because of Foreman's life, we can travel through his chronological lifespan to go to, he becomes a good fighter. I mean, he starts training at 17. And then is it a couple of years later, he goes to the Olympics in 1968?
Yeah. So, you know, the way he says it, he didn't really follow or know much about boxing when he was living in Houston. He takes one trip to Sugarland, so the local big state pen. It was supposed to be a scare tactic because of some of the things he was getting into. But he did notice one guy kind of stand out. Just, you know, Foreman said, as a teenager with kind of low confidence, this guy he could see was confident. Wasn't that big, but, you know, he looked clean shaven, put together, you know, his prison jumper fit nicely. And like Foreman's like, this guy is who I, you know, what I see myself, and asked his brother who took him there, his brother Sonny, he says, oh, he's a slugger. And Foreman's like, what's a slugger? Oh, he's a boxer. You know, and that was almost like planted the seed of, oh, I wonder what this boxing is. And he listened to a couple fights with his brother and his friends once, some Ali fights. You know, and then when he was in the Job Corps in the middle of nowhere, Oregon, he listens to Ali Patterson fight. But that was the first time where he said, you know, some friends in the Job Corps were making some cracks about, well, you think you're so tough, because he had some issues with violence, especially early on in the Job Corps. Maybe you should be a boxer. And he thinks, well, maybe I should try this boxing, you know. And he had literally never punched with a glove on his fist until he asked for a transfer from Oregon to a more urban camp in Pleasanton, California, where they had stuff. They had recreational programs, and they had a boxing team and an actual coach who knew boxing. And that's the first time he gets into boxing. But he's kind of hesitant. I mean, he's big, which means there aren't many competitors, right? There aren't that many heavyweights when you're talking about teenagers. But he's not great. You know, as anyone who's ever tried it, and I only tried a little bit because when I was on the combine circuit in football, we had the guy that ran us through that was also a boxing coach. So sometimes he would take us to his gym for like a day off, put gloves on, try a couple things, you know, he'd show us, maybe a punch, maybe a slip, let us hit each other for a while, maybe put us in with one of his students, some of the men and women that actually did this for real, and then we'd get embarrassed, you know. But if you ever try it, you realize all of a sudden, you know, this is like foreign. It's like stepping on a skateboard the first time. Like this is not, it's not natural, you know. So putting skates on, it's just not something that you intuitively do well. And I think he finds that pretty quickly. But he sticks with it in part because he's made to stick with it, because it's his boxing coach is helping to keep him in the Job Corps when he gets in some trouble outside of it. You know, he sticks with boxing. He starts to learn a little bit more of it, but he's still not all in. And I think that's kind of what sets him apart from some other young boxers that experience success and that say, I'm doing this. I can't wait to be a champion. I can't wait for all this. He's very much, yeah, I'll get a trophy and go home to Houston and brag about it, you know, and that's about as much as he wants. He is again sort of forced into boxing some more because he doesn't have any alternatives in Houston, even after he graduates Job Corps, and he goes back and he's kind of dragged along the amateur circuit by his coach at the time, Doc Brodus, to train for the Olympics. And I mean, he wants to be in the Olympics and win a gold medal, sure, but he's not like singularly focused. And I don't even know if he really believed it. But he got better, and sometimes he got a little bit lucky, and he kept working at it. And even after the gold medal, he's not 100% sure he's going pro. And most Olympic gold medalists we know now, I mean, they might be buying their time trying to get that gold medal to get a pro contract. But if they were offered the pro contract before, we wouldn't be seeing them in the Olympics. You know, Doc Brodus tells him when he graduates Job Corps, listen, I'll get some people together to front you the money like they did for Ali in Louisville or for Frazier in Philadelphia. You know, we can let you train and pay you a little bit. And Foreman's like, I don't think I want to do that. You know, I mean, he's not ready to commit. So it's really this slow burning love for boxing. Now, if you talk to him, this is the thing he likes to talk about the most. I mean, he still watches boxing. He's a knowledgeable guy about boxing. I mean, he pays attention. He's obviously had contact with some of the greats of the sport. So he's got some really interesting insight, and he loves it, you know. But it was not an immediate thing. It was a very slow relationship with George Foreman in boxing.
Wow. And I think this is why I think it's so interesting to use him to kind of unpack the business of boxing, or, you know, this time frame. Tanisha and I talk about this, and I'm sure, you know, the acts of a boxer's life. You know, you have the amateur career or the young training. And then usually, hopefully they do well. You know, if they're young and they get on a hot streak, they can go and get a title. And then, you know, the second act usually has financial boom, but also financial boom, because they just don't, the structure's not there. We can talk more about that, Tanisha, to, you know, with the obligations of being carried in there, and then you have to pay people back. And then we'll get into the third act, because George Foreman completely rewrites all of this. And I think starting in 1968 in Mexico City, he's seen waving the flag. And this happens to be also 1968, what was going on with Ali, where he was, you know, not going into the draft. And there was a very much a rift with the way kind of society was looking at Ali, or certain members were. But he's waving the flag. Does that also inform his personality? Because it seems also like Foreman's always finding himself, and he's trying on personalities. Did he embrace being this kind of symbol of America, or was that something he was not comfortable with?
He did a few days after. You have to, I think you hit the nail on the head. This is an impressionable young man, especially at the time. He's 19. A lot of us, when we were 19, were in the middle of a lot of different changes, whether it was, you know, frosted tips in our hair like the boy bands did or something. You know, we all made some questionable decisions. He was on a team. They were all men of color. I want to say 9 African Americans, 2 Latinos. I could be off, but I mean, all men of color, but also majority service members. You know, that's where a lot of the amateur fighters came from in the 1960s, were from service academies. In fact, some of them tried to pick Foreman up off the Job Corps. And because Doc Brodus was also a service member, retired, he knew they were coming, and Foreman describes it as he cussed them all the way down the driveway of Pleasanton. So he's surrounded by people that are very pro-establishment and pro-administration, even though this, was a very liberal administration. They were pro-traditional nation state, and that's what he's being inundated with as the revolt of the black athlete is swirling around them. The boxing team didn't have anyone with that same kind of college experience as some of the leading people in the revolt of the black athlete, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, let alone Lou Alcindor, who was going to turn into Kareem shortly after, and some of these big name team sport athletes or track athletes that got a lot of attention and that went to colleges because that's what you had to do in those sports. You don't have to go to college to get into boxing. In fact, usually that doesn't lead you very far into boxing. So he's really divorced from that world, the revolt of the black athlete. And he says that the Olympic Project for Human Rights people didn't really come to the boxing team. I know when they got either into Mexico City or close to Mexico City as a team, there were opportunities to go hear the OPHR, and I don't think he availed himself of those opportunities. I mean, really, it was just, over the head of a 19-year-old who dropped out of school in middle school, who hadn't spent a day in high school. So for him to wave the flag that one of the assistant coaches, who was also a service member, Hal Rogers, puts in his pocket, was really a no-brainer. I mean, sure, okay. And if you look at the tape, you also see how little effort he puts into that, verse when he kind of catches his breath, and he'll tell you he was out of breath from, by the end of the first round. The altitude is high. He's thrown a lot of punches. He's really struggling just to keep his oxygen, So even though it's been a couple of minutes after he's been announced as the winner and they stop the fight, he's trying to catch his breath. The flag wave is, a little thing. When he finally composes himself, it's this dance that he's doing. Olympic gold medalists typically bow to the four corners, and he's not just bowing, he's kind of like dancing and juking a little bit between corners. And some people, I think, would recognize it if you played sports and you sort of visualize what's going to happen. I mean, touchdown dances aren't spontaneous. You've thought about that, and it doesn't mean you're going to score a touchdown. And some of us scored precious few over a lot of years on defense. But when it happened, if we danced, like, we were ready for the moment. It feels like that's what he was ready for. If he had visualized winning at all, that's kind of what he had put some thought and effort into. The flag wave, not so much. But you're right, shortly after that, he gets a lot of positive publicity, largely because it can be seen as a counter to what we had just had Carlos and Smith on the victory stand, and other people making similar statements too. They get a lot of the publicity because it was such a high-profile event. But lots of people used the Olympics in 1968 to make their stand, even if it was turning their back against the Soviet Union's flag because they were native Czechs being persecuted in their homeland. So for him to be that one defender of traditional nation states, and the fact that he was a black man and from an urban center and from chronic poverty, a lot of people wanted to project that story as far as they could, especially when we are weeks away from a presidential election, right? So he gets a lot of really positive responses, and he rolls with it. He says, okay. He said at home he didn't. At home he had friends and family with Smith and Carlos posters, in their place, and he's walking around with his gold medal, and he's getting shade, and he recognizes that he is, he's alienated some people who saw his demonstration, as a rejection of where they wanted to go. But in a lot of the country, he's exactly what people wanted to see, and so he plays that patriotic shtick when he decides to turn pro, as far as he can. John F.X. Condon, right, who did the public relations for Madison Square Garden, immediately when Foreman signs for his debut fight and it's going to be at Madison Square Garden, Condon says, can we get you to hand out some miniature American flags in front of the Garden? Because it's like a Tuesday night fight. It's not a blockbuster, right? It's on the undercard, I want to say, of Joe Frazier, Jimmy Ellis, or like an okay heavyweight fight, but not, again, an earth-shattering. So, we need to sell some tickets. Would you be willing to do it? Yeah, sure. He's wearing red, white, and blue trunks. He's sort of plays up that image as much as he can until it feels like it's not valuable anymore. And that's when you see, even in his early 20s, he starts changing images
Yeah.
to drive up some popularity because he recognizes, and the folks that he's working with, and by this point it's Dick Sadler, who's a real old school, old time boxing manager. You know, they recognize that what you do in the ring isn't nearly as important as how you're perceived outside the ring. You know, this is like I think want to say it was Les Matthews in the Amsterdam News, is a hot pants contest. You know, this has nothing to do with fighting. It's how you look, and it's what people want to see. And so he changes his image to be more interesting, more marketable. You know, even from his earliest pro days, he says, "Well, this isn't working. Let's try this," and it did work. You know, and it jumps him up the ratings far more than any one of his fights did.
And so, yeah, please jump in too. So this image change was for patriotic, flag wearing, to the more Sonny Liston, cooler, more meaner. I think he'll even say he was, or is that another shift?
So there's a little time in between. A lot of people wanted to draw the Sonny Liston connection also because Foreman trained with Liston, you know, so it was easy to say, oh, he's just acting like that guy. And Foreman did really respect Liston.
Yeah.
But not, you know, he respected Liston because Liston showed him how to get a haircut before they went to Vegas, you know, and had like a closet full of suits and get his shoes shined and showed him how to tip and stuff like that, you know, adult things, classy things that Foreman hadn't been exposed to. You know, the mean gruff for Liston, I mean, that was probably authentic. This was a guy with a really hard life, who was involved with some really rough people. And, you know, I don't think there was any image construction. I think that's who Sonny Liston was. For Foreman, you know, he's not just quiet like Liston was. You know, he just becomes a little cooler. And I think, you know, I related it to the early blaxploitation films that are coming out at the time, where all of those heroes are really anti-heroes, right? I mean, they're pulled into conflicts. Shaft isn't trying to save the neighborhood. He's pulled into a conflict. He's like, all right, fine. If I have to do it, I'll get the mob and, you know, the thinly veiled Panthers out of my area so that I can restore normalcy while still getting the girl, you know. And they were so cool, and they were so curt. You know, they didn't have long monologues, you know, but what they said was just, it was funny, it was fierce, and it feels like that's what he starts going for. You know, he's dressing well, he's acting cool, but he also gets showed up, you know, when he tries to you know, introduce himself to really cool people like Walt Frazier, right, or even Jim Brown, and they're not impressed. This guy hasn't done anything yet. You know, he looks like he's trying a little too hard. And for him, that's just like another lesson in that the cool pose, right? Of like, oh, you know, Walt Frazier really means it. Like, he's not putting on a show. Jim Brown really doesn't care who you are, you know, until you can do something for him. And so he just sort of doubles down on that. But it's not like he is reclusive. I mean, he's still talking to people. He's just trying to be a little funnier. And I will say, you know, I think he naturally is a pretty funny person. You know, I bet he probably always wanted to be funny. I bet, like a lot of people, he just didn't want to be that vulnerable for a lot of years and put it out there, especially self-deprecating humor, which, you know, not everyone is comfortable with.
Right.
You know, he grew into that. I feel like that's probably the way he always would have rather been able to act if he felt like he could. It just took a long time for him to get to that point.
Yeah, I think it takes a lot of people a long time to get to being comfortable and using self-deprecating humor to, because we know, but oftentimes that's a mask of a very, you know, it's the happy clown, sad clown, you know, thing where it's, you know, you're really hurting inside, but it's like, let me diss myself before you even get a chance to.
Exactly.
So now the pain, I'm not giving you the pleasure of having that first punch, you know,
Yeah.
so you're taking it upon yourself. And it speaks to like just the evolution of just like even our own self-concept, right? Of like how we even envision ourselves and like this, and the role of personality and like brand identity in this stuff. It's huge because it even like per the timeline you've kind of laid out, it's like, okay, that flag waving, that first time, that was just such a, off the cuff, not a planned thing, but everyone saw the opportunity in that, and the variance of reaction in different communities of being kind of shunned within your own. They're like, dude, really? And then everybody else be like, yay, like finally one on our side,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah. So his friends won't talk to him, some of them in Houston, but Vince
right.
Lombardi will come up to him when he's in DC at a restaurant and talk to him. I mean, there's
Wow.
Right, and we know there's
different
agendas for
worlds. Yes, absolutely.
we know there's agendas in that. We know that there's, that there's like, oh, look, see, yeah. It's like, we know that that is a part of the game. And it's like, oh, good, hook, line, sinker one, right? And then being aware of that, and for him, and seeing all of those kind of moments as learning opportunities, and like, okay, well, it's like, now when am I going to who is me? Like, when am I just going to be myself and not have something be forced upon? Which is why it's so interesting here. You say it's like, Jim Brown and Walt were like, dude, that's such a front. Like, I don't know which one are you at, So it's interesting just hearing about personalities and the way that athletes will try to brand themselves into something that's marketable,
Yeah.
which obviously more power to you, because we know that's what sells tickets, drives money, as this being the only option of making a living, or given athleticism and talent. But at what expense? What are you selling?
Yeah,
In
and
the
I think
MMA world, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I just think that's what makes Foreman a little unique
Right,
compared to a lot of other boxers, is that he
right.
seems to have got that really early to said, okay, it's not just practice and perfecting my craft. There's this whole outside world, and he changes a lot over time. So when we look at the drastic changes in the two George Foremans, it's like, what, he'd been changing constantly
His
for the
whole life.
same reason, to try and
Yeah.
move up and accomplish his goals. Um, he just had to try a bunch of different ways and a few different times to do it.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's so fascinating, like, because we probably can't go through every phase of Foreman. We could talk about, like, when he tried to he fought 5 guys and how insane that was. I mean, that was like peak angry Foreman, and you go through that. But it's interesting when you compare. We were talking about Ali and how I just watched the Holmes versus Ali
That
documentary.
30 for 30.
Oh,
The
so,
mustache is so bad. The mustache ruins it for everyone.
and it's just so sad because you can see him getting weak.
Yeah.
There's something off, and yet he's not willing to admit that. The
Right.
people around him aren't willing to admit that. They just want the money, and it's so sad. And he's like a sideshow where they bring in these, like country club yuppies to watch him train in his, space. And it's like, that is showing someone who would not change. And who knows if he did, but fortunately we talked about how his voice was not as clear and then eventually muted. And so we don't even know. He could have gone through this and had, shifts, but because Foreman has this, and this divine intervention, psychic break, whatever it was, and it was this was after which fight was it that he
loses to Jimmy Young on St. Patrick's Day, 1977. Unexpected for a lot of people, but if you listen to him and you sort of read around it, there might have been some backdoor deals already made. Don King had already kind of stolen Jimmy Young from his managers. There were some other maybe criminal elements tied up into that. Blinky Palermo was rumored to be part of Jimmy Young's camp, and Blinky Palermo was with Frankie Carbo, sort of the two faces of the mob influence in boxing in the 1950s. They got the IBC in a lot of trouble and ultimately dissolved as a trust, right? So there were a lot of questions swirling, but ultimately, it was kind of like Ali and Zaire. It was a hot night, humid. Foreman made some mistakes, maybe didn't realize what was going on early enough, change his style early enough, landed one big shot, but wasn't quite big enough. And even though he made it through the end, it was, pretty obvious he wasn't going to win that decision. And then, he has a born again experience, according to him anyway, in the dressing room. that really changes his life. But, if you look back, this is a guy that grew up, even in the Fifth Ward of Houston, there's a Baptist church, every other corner, it feels like. He knew religion. He didn't talk about it much, but when you see him quoted in Houston newspapers early in his career, you do start to see references to Jesus and God, like a lot of athletes. And you got to wonder if it has to do with some of the papers that his family was going to be reading. Okay, so he spoke Christian, even if maybe he wasn't, a regularly practicing Christian. He says things about how, the first time he'd been called a Christian, when Ali called him a Christian and followed it up with some epithets after that he didn't really know what one was. And like, well, okay, maybe you didn't, but you knew what church was, you spoke the vernacular. And he had certainly used it after losing to Ali, when he's trying to, again, marshal support for a rematch and get a chance to fight back. It's actually Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, one of his managers, who suggests to Foreman, he says, Ali is a Muslim. And obviously this guy knew, working with Kareem, what that meant in America. He said, maybe you should, be a little more Christian. And all of a sudden Foreman's going on the 700 Club and Robert Schuler's Crystal Cathedral when it was still, the Garden Grove or whichever one, and sort of talking about and playing up some of those Christian ideas. So it's not like this came out of nowhere, I don't think. But he's also someone who, for a couple of years before that point, had made these comments about, it's not what age you retire at, it's at what income. When you make enough, you should be able to leave. So he was clearly thinking about the end point already. And I think he loses to Jimmy Young. He feels like it was as fixed a fight as you could be, and not the old school, stay down because there's a gun pointed at your head, but where all of the deck is stacked against you, and it's still a gamble, but the people are gambling with a good feeling that they're going to hit on this, and so I think he just says, I can't win. A few years I've been trying to get the rematch with Ali. It's not happening. This fight with Jimmy Young, everything seems against me. And so he sees the light one way or the other, and retires on Mother's Day, and gets really involved with a particular church in Houston. And again, that took some time. He visited a few churches. He knew he was kind of looking for some spirituality. He didn't know exactly what it was. He sort of finds in this one kind of blend of Baptist Pentecostalism, something that he thought fit. It, was really intense. There was speaking in tongues. There was witnessing and testifying, but he had all of that energy and intensity. Maybe that really spoke to him as a way to sort of get fully invested in something else. And he ends up becoming an ordained minister, even though he breaks with that church and starts his own. I mean, he really does. That wasn't a sham. That was a decade that he really gave himself to preaching, and not to make money. He wasn't using his name to get people in his church. His church was mostly family and friends. He wasn't trying to make, the kind of for-profit churches or televangelist kind of money that was really prominent in the 80s. That wasn't really his goal. But he also, after a decade of that and not making any money, realizes that even some of the great ideas he had, now he can't pay for. Wanting to start a youth center because he sees kids like him, and he's in a similar neighborhood. He just kind of ekes further northeast from Houston in the Fifth Ward to, just into Humble, to just into Kingwood, which is a little nicer, and now on the Houston Commons, which is really nice. He just sort of ekes in that direction. So he's still surrounded by kids that he saw himself in, but now he's not able to help. And that's where, like a lot of people, especially a lot of Black men in America, it's okay, well, what can you do to make a lot of money fast? And Tanisha, like you said, it's, can you play a sport? Can you do something entertaining that can get you a lot of money quickly? And he realizes boxing is still the fastest way to money for him, no matter what.
Right. And the smallest percentage of making success probably as well. And the story you just mentioned, it reminded me of one of the quotes that you said Foreman said in describing the nature of boxing, and that this is a gangster's game.
Yeah.
because of even just how it will break you, even emotionally, your own identity, like what that even means, and then looking for other avenues, like you said, and not being able to afford such, and then going into, you know, the church and figuring and realize and seeing yourself and others and not having the means or words or the direction and how to guide them so that you don't see uh, any other um, you know, any other like horrible instances of where it could go wrong and it's something tragic can happen. And so it's like I've always just I loved that phrase, like just a gangster's game. Like I love that. And can you tell me some context about like how he said that and how that kind of just relates to all this?
Yeah, I mean, that was him sort of reminiscing on this Jimmy Young fight. But the other thing about George Foreman is, you know, this wasn't an epiphany in 1977 because the manager that led him into the pros, Dick Sadler, like I said, was an old school guy, and old school, like going through the IBC era of the 1950s and all of that, you know, open mob influence in the sport. And so he and Foreman, in that sort of first iteration of a professional, are really barnstorming. And that wasn't Sadler's idea. He came from Doc Kearns, who was the manager of Jack Dempsey. I mean, this is how far back we're going in boxing. And so that's what Sadler learned from Kearns. You just barnstorm around, small fights, small cash, but you're building a resume, a paper record, you're getting your name in the newspaper, you're making connections, right? But that also meant that Foreman's on the road with Sadler all the time. You know, Sadler did his laundry, did everything. They're together all the time. And he's just telling him old stories about boxing. But a lot of these old stories are terrible, you know. So he's telling Foreman about how, you know, he'll never talk to Archie Moore again because he was managing Moore in a fight against this Cassius Clay kid. And, you know, all of a sudden in the fourth round, Moore kicks the stool and, you know, takes a dive. And he wasn't mad that Moore took a dive. He's mad that Moore didn't tell him ahead of time he was going to take a dive because then Sadler could have placed a bet. You know, it's not like anyone really thought that Moore was going to beat Ali. It's that Ali had called it in the fourth round, you know, and as the hype machine got going and people started, well, Archie Moore, the old mongoose, the professor of boxing, he's, you know, long history. There's no way he's going out in four. The odds got a little bit, you know, shorter, but also the betting on the fourth round, you know, would have been a really good bet by fight night. So Sadler's telling Foreman stories like this. You know, you've got an already cynical kid from a rough neighborhood who's really, you know, just skeptical and justifiably so, right? Skeptical of the world around him. And you're feeding him all of these stories. It's ingrained in him. You know, he's constantly looking out for people trying to cheat him, trying to screw him. And it doesn't stop people from doing it. You know, his friend from the Job Corps that he hires as a business manager ends up selling all of his stuff and one of his houses underneath him, you know. So it doesn't save him from all of this, but it means he's really attuned to it. And so that's why, whether it's factual or not, what he sees in the mid to late 70s, you know, he's pretty sure that the fight with Ali and Zaire was similarly fixed. A lot of people from both sides threw a lot of money at referees and judges and, you know, bad water and, you know, questionable strategies and advice from the corner and all these kinds of things. And again, maybe, maybe not, but that's what he honestly believes because he knew this was such a part of the sport, you know. And so I think when he calls it a gangster's game, I mean, he's looking through a lot of history and he's seeing his fights through that lens and, you know, pretty certain that there are some questionable elements, maybe for, but certainly against him, especially we get to the mid late 1970s.
Damn.
Yeah. Thank you for asking about that, the gangster reference there, because you would think one thing I noticed about him in this, when he gets into the church, he starts giving things away. People say he gets kinder, funnier, and I think the funnier is this ability of being more vulnerable, self-reflective. Because I heard that he becomes friends with Ali.
Yeah. I don't think he ever really felt the same about Ali as Joe Frazier did. I think George Foreman always recognized it was kind of part of the game. You know, he didn't like some of the stuff Ali said about him, okay, but also, I was asking about the story of the boxing writers dinner where he and Ali get in an actual physical
Yeah.
fight before Zaire, and he's telling me, "Oh, I knew I was going to rip his jacket." Like he had talked to people months before about how if they get in a situation, Ali wears cheap suits, he's going to rip his jacket from the back because it just makes such a scene. Like he knew he was going to do that. He didn't know how Ali was going to react. He didn't expect him to start hucking drinking glasses across, a nice room in the Waldorf Astoria. Okay. And I don't think anyone did. That really caught him by surprise. But I think for him, he always kind of understood it was part of the game. And Joe Frazier never did. Frazier took it really, Frazier literally handed Ali money out of his pocket when he was exiled to help him out.
Yes.
Frazier really thought he was helping a friend. And when Ali said those things about him, which he probably didn't feel that way about Joe Frazier. I don't know that many people that could dislike Joe Frazier, right? When Ali said a lot of those things about him being ignorant or ugly or comparing him to a gorilla, Ali was being Ali. He was getting the hype machine going. He was selling tickets, and Frazier just couldn't separate himself from what was being said. I don't think Foreman ever took it really personally,
Yeah.
So it was easy for them to remain friends through the 80s. And Foreman also, in terms of, a religious person, he preached hard. I met a lawyer in Houston who we just sort of randomly met in the street when I was on my way to find some other documents. But, when he heard about what I was doing there, said, "Oh yeah, when I first moved here from New York, right there's the courthouse where Foreman was always standing on the steps, pounding the Bible and yelling about Jesus." And it was like, people would tell me that's George Foreman. I'd be like, "No, that's not George Foreman." He preached hard, but he wasn't really proselytizing. I mean, he wasn't trying to go out and get converts. He wanted everyone to know what he knew and feel what he felt, but he wasn't necessarily trying to, rack up conversions. So when he talked to Ali, and they would talk about religion, of course, Foreman could tell him what he heard and what he saw and what he felt. And Ali could tell him or ask him questions about why you think that and why you believe that and why couldn't Allah be the same as God and some of these things. I think they had a really good relationship, and it's sort of a mutually stimulating relationship, particularly when they were both out of boxing by the mid 80s.
Yeah. And then I'd like to go into the third act because, again, what is so interesting about using the vehicle of Foreman to kind of understand what's going on in society and what's going on in boxing is this third act. And Tanisha and I have talked about that. I mean, look at what Liston, they had a documentary on Showtime, and it's like, if you want to just be depressed for the whole day, watch that. Or, you look at Joe Louis, you look at, other, I mean, Ali, you could say his third act as well. We do talk about how Mike Tyson might be, having a different one.
Yeah.
Foreman decides to go back at 38, trains, he's bigger, but he kind of embraces it. And I remember seeing a quote where he said, "I may not be able to get the belt around my waist, but all these great things."
Yeah.
And has a successful, climb back. Eventually I think he fights Tommy and wins against Tommy Morrison for the vacant title, wins the title back, has a TV show. I remember this TV show. George on ABC. I don't know how many seasons it got.
It got a season, and it might even have been a truncated season.
Maybe not, that was the apex of, but he was lovable. Everyone. And I think, the culmination is the grill, which Tanisha said she still has her George Foreman grill. Mine, I think, is in a box somewhere in my attic. The entrepreneur, that the person who had to go back into boxing as his only way. And we talk about this as a Black athlete or Black individual with your limited options. How does the entrepreneur aspect of his life?
Yeah, when he first came back, he wasn't embracing all of that image automatically, right? When he first comes back, I think he's very much trying to be taken seriously. He lost a ton of weight, even though he was bigger, lost a ton of weight. He was a serious boxer. He was seriously out for the title. Yeah, sure, he's fighting people you've never heard of in places you've never really been to, the same way that he started his pro career. And that was also a conscious choice. He said, he was going to be his own promoter. He wasn't going to have a promoter. He wasn't going to, couldn't get calls back from managers like Gil Clancy that had managed him before, or even Don King that he was working with in the late 70s, So he was going to do it all himself, old school, the way that he knew. Small clubs. He wouldn't take much off the top. He would wait for gates and receipts at the back end, bet on himself. He would essentially bet on himself, right? And so he did that. But the reporters, obviously, were in the late 80s and then the early 90s, wanted to make a big deal about how big a deal he was. They wanted to make some jokes. And initially he says, he kind of got upset, right? And he asked his brother who was working with him, he says, okay, well, how much for me to take out my own ads, my own, and I'll get back at them. And his brother looks it up and tells him, he's like, oh, let them talk, let them write what they want. And then he realized he could harness the power of other sports journalists for himself. So if he read something funny about himself and then said it to someone else the next day, they would quote him because they got it direct from the source, even though he was borrowing it from someone else, but it would get his name recycled and get more attention. And so I think he really made peace with the fact that there really isn't bad publicity in boxing. They're making fun of me for being big. I'll order a tray of burgers to the press conference, right? Which led to some of the endorsement deals that he didn't think about. Lots of people didn't think about, because also the 80s when we were really just starting Bono's campaigns, right? And Jordan's and thinking about the endorsement potential of some of these star athletes, right? When they start coming in, he actually calls Bill Cosby and asks if he should be doing this, right? And Bill Cosby at the time, was on everything, right? From Jello to I don't even know what, he was everywhere. And Cosby says, yeah, do it, take it. If you don't, I will, give me the number, so he realizes, I think, the massive potential of just being likable, no matter how that comes by. If they want to make fun, play along with the jokes. If they want to make a crack about your weight, roll with it, double down on it, tell it to someone else and make it go viral before there was such thing as viral, right? And that does lay the foundation for someone who's so much more valuable than just as an athlete.
That's huge. And I love looking at that from like the branding perspective too. And it's like of them as a business and within their model, because you can, as long as you're aware and just cognizant of what's going on in the sports media space, then it's like you can just see now that there are actual honest personalities and opportunities to align your brand with that and reach a whole new audience that you ordinarily wouldn't have, Absolutely. And then for the athletes to just now have new means of and streams of revenue that they ordinarily wouldn't be privy to, because it seems like in boxing, the promoter, the / manager means more in that sport than any other. And
sure.
And so the demand for, or at least requirement to have a sustainable income relies on sponsors, relies on other means of revenue and money coming in from, so it's I love that act of Foreman in this, because Nancy and I were talking earlier, it's like there's probably a lot of young generations that only know him from The Grill, that only know Mike Tyson from Hangover, that only,
Yes,
and so
definitely. He said his own kids, were calling him George because they just saw him on TV being called George all the time, because he had so many commercials.
It's crazy.
On. You think Mike Tyson didn't get those endorsement deals at the same time, right? And like I said, I was, growing up, community housing, mid to late 80s. I thought Tyson was, probably the greatest, most exciting athlete out there. And the fact that he would walk out to the ring with Tupac was like, extra for, for folks in my situation. But for a lot of people, say, who were on Madison Avenue, that connection, especially to, what was being sort of subclassified as gangster rap, was a real negative. Like, I don't know if we want this person selling our product because of what he represents, right? And George Foreman was so safe in that regard.
Yeah, it's amazing, like seeing how that makes a difference. Like, if you're intimidating, if you're scary like that, it's like, do I want you on my Wheaties box, or things like that, And it's like there are some, though, I've seen even like in the NFL kind of more recently within the last 5 years, like Marshawn Lynch and Skittles. You know, you just fucking love Skittles,
Yeah.
you know, and it's like he's himself and he doesn't care. And I love his authenticity. He's just such a real dude. And then now every time I see a video, like he had a show on Bleacher Report for a while, like on Facebook, called like No Script with Marshawn Lynch. And it was just like him with like, you know, the record hula hoop, not hula hoop, but like the limbo girl and just like random acts and funny people, and he's just himself, and it's like a giant bag of Skittles right there, you know, because they know he loves them. And then, you know, when he comes to the Raiders and he opens a truck, and Steve Nash for some reason opens this door, and then nothing but Skittles comes out, and it's like, I love that. And I love when brands will take a chance, and like even when somebody can be branded as like controversial or negative or maybe intimidating, but it's like, you know what, I'm a dude, I'm a real person, and it's like I will have more acts. This won't be who I always will be, you know? So taking a chance on that. And we're seeing that, I think, with Mike Tyson more specifically, and from like that horrifying, like scariest human on the planet to like podcast cannabis owning, like cool dude now, right? Like everybody wants to talk to. It's fascinating.
Yeah, that's one thing too about the 21st century, and particularly the social media explosion, is that all of those, you know, subgenres, subsets are now recognized as niches that you could probably hit, you know, whereas it feels like in the 80s and the 90s, it was still that attempt to get, you know, the biggest group the easiest way. And that really did, you know, bury a lot of great athletes from endorsement deals because they might not, right? Whereas now we can say, okay, well, if you've got enough of an Instagram following, you can sell something for us. And it might not be the top selling endorsement deal, but you'll do well for our product with this niche of people. And we can, you know, give you a little bit on the side. And it's just such a different world of marketing.
Absolutely. The real estate of what you were bargaining for, that ad time has multiplied 1,000 times. If you were only looking for ad space for, you know, 30 seconds on the Super Bowl weekend, you know, or it's not just traditional anymore. So definitely, I think the advancement of media and technology has afforded athletes now more than ever more opportunities to brand themselves and make themselves entrepreneurs, as you know, to which I'm sure you know folks like Foreman, Tyson, and everyone before wishes they would have had that type of opportunity.
Yeah.
And well, you know, we were talking about this too in terms of writing, in terms of social media. You don't have to go through the press to connect to your fans. Right away here, and I think especially in MMA, I don't know if you're familiar with Paige Van Zandt. She says she gets more money through Instagram ads than she does from purses. So there's even that ability. Now, as we're talking to some writers or reporters, and they're like, sometimes the way they craft their brand or their persona, you're seeing some misses because they don't have someone who could maybe have this observer point of view. But so let's move in because we actually have the main card here starting. Can I ask you, you know, if you're looking at our current heavyweights that we have now, Deontay Wilder, Tyson Fury, got Anthony Joshua, is it Parker Morgan? Is he still in the kind of realm? Or I'm trying to think of the main people. It looks like Tyson Fury has had another act, and we've talked about him before. He's a complicated individual. And you know, Deontay Wilder, why is it that, I mean, he had a title, heavyweight. Why didn't more people know him? Because he seems like on paper he's got the bronze, you know, bronze bomber, great guy, dad. Seems like you know, has a lot of the ingredients. Why is he not being talked in these conversations as much?
I mean, I feel like it has a lot to do just with the decline of interest in boxing over such a long period, that to get another generation now of people reinterested in the sport is going to take a lot. Now, you'd mentioned, you know, folks like Tiger Woods getting a whole lot of people interested in a sport they hadn't watched real quick. That could happen, absolutely, because especially in North America, we're so fascinated with dynasties and with greatness, right? That there's always that chance, but it is an uphill climb for sure. You know, boxing is such a unique sport. Now it's in direct competition with MMA, which, 10, 20 years ago was not the same landscape. So it's going to be hard for anyone to generate, I think, a huge following in the United States. It's going to take something pretty extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just the climate and the audience in the US has changed, because a lot of people said, well, when Klitschko had the title, we just didn't have an American champion, and so that was part of the disconnect. But you're saying also just not having the awareness, the consumption's not there.
Yeah. Part of it too is that there's not enough being put into digital and in the spaces to promote it. It's like, give me the content, give me some shoulder programming, some bait that's going to make me invested, especially if now you're looking to retrain or revitalize a younger generation that may not know the history, is particularly in the heavyweight division, which in my opinion is always the one that will be the flagship of like combat sports.
Right.
So it's like, if it's been dormant for a while, now this is the opportunity. Now it's because of technology and the way that younger generations are consuming media. Use these spaces to now create content, tell us our stories. Why do I care? These things aren't leading first take anymore. Like there's no attention being put to it. And so I think if you highlight these profile pieces, you show these feature stories, you make some more video games, you do things, you create extra content that just crosses the whole ecosystem and these multiple touch points of where people can get invested. Now you've got an opportunity to be like, oh, okay, to slowly build up this burner so that eventually it can become like a massive fire. Because per your point, when UFC, so it's funny, in doing all of these talks lately, I've heard a lot of different people say like what got them hooked, right? Like Josh was like, oh, dude, it was when I saw Kimbo Slice. This is like in his backyard stuff and how he came in here. And it's like, that dude was insane. And so like, and then for some, it was the first season of The Ultimate Fighter. So it's like, I understand there's the Contender series and like, and that was a good effort, but it's like, okay, has it stopped? I don't know. Like where are they now? There's just, and because I think what I said earlier of like the role of the promoter and the manager is so important in this, it kind of gets in the way. It's hard to understand. Why is there an interim in every damn division? What weight is this? It just seems far too complicated. And so if there's a way to just create enough content and tell a story and make me emotionally invested, at least in wanting to, okay, Wilder's up and in 3 months, I'm going to make sure I watch that, create some boxing hard knocks versions of these types of things. I think that would certainly help spark that kindle a little bit so that it could at least grow up or glow up and put some more attention onto it,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, gosh, we have a fight here. It's interesting to see if boxing, a lot of people say that they might, we see that sometimes the main event in boxing, if it's on the same Saturday night as UFC, they would wait for UFC to end, which is showing, for me, it's like saying, it's like the cool kid, Jim Brown, or no, I guess it would be Foreman, Jim Brown, you're cooler than me because we're going to wait it out. We're going to have Canelo like laying down on a couch because they can't start that fight because, so it's interesting if they might also adapt. Tanisha and I, looking at today, 5 fights, seeing how like 2 of these fights, I think there was a total of 10 fights between all 4 of the people, building the cards so that it's much more of an experience that you're watching, that you're going to settle in for. I've been having it on here, and this unfortunately is much more appealing than the undercard was. So it'll be interesting to see. We have Tuesdays and Thursdays. I know I just threw a lot out there. What do you think of that? And also, what do you think of safety?
Yeah, I'm obviously really concerned about safety generally. If we talk about bringing back sports, and I, love sports as much as anyone, and had to make the difficult decision, like a lot of parents, with no live sports on and kids at home, to jettison cable for Disney Plus because it just made more sense,
Wise decision. Yes.
Yeah. I understand all of the precautions that Top Rank and ESPN and the venues are going through. And then there's also part of me that's saying, if we have to do all of this, should we be putting it on? You know, and I think, right, the positive test already, before, um, maybe it was necessary to make us realize that this is still a risk, and the people that we're putting at risk now are not the people who could afford to buy the tickets, right? They're the people that are in the ring in the moment, that that are kind of trapped in this, and I'm not sure that's fair. I will definitely not be watching the fights, but watching the TV ratings as they come out the next couple of days, and I'll be curious to see what this does and what that means, and if that's going to encourage other sports to consider fanless productions, which can certainly be done. There was a lot of concern in boxing in the 70s about, are they even going to put fights on anymore, or just because they were all closed circuit television events anyway. Do we even need fans? And someone suddenly is remembering Mike Jacobs in the 30s saying maybe all the fights will take place in a television studio now, which he probably never said, and it probably never wasn't going to happen. But there was definitely that fear already in the 1970s that we didn't need people, right? The tickets were really just garnish. The money came from the TV deals, and boxing only went further down that road as we transitioned from closed circuit to pay-per-view direct in your house, right? So it will be interesting to see if this gives boxing high enough TV ratings, because the competition is so thin in
Yeah.
the sports world, and if it encourages boxing to keep going, if it pushes other sports to get back and on television, even if they're not live viewed, and then the trickle down effect from there of what other components of our cities are we going to re-engage with a lot of other people, and under what circumstances, right? And especially those working in the college environment are also, I think, watching that stuff closely, because we want to know what our students are willing to risk to come to campus, and what our institutions are willing to do to meet students' needs, and protect faculty and staff. It's really unprecedented, very interesting, regardless of what does or doesn't happen in the ring, right? But really interesting to see what happens in the days coming out.
Yes, Andrew, I can agree with you more. I'm watching all of this as well. In terms of, we mentioned college sports, there's a lot of TV ratings hooked onto that. And so you mentioned, what are they going to risk? What might institutions for their financial health do so that they can put sports back on? At least, let's just be honest, college football,
Yep.
what they're really talking about, so I have a meeting with American on Thursday, where they're going to give us an idea, and it's interesting, how that's going to all play out. And yeah, in terms of, I guess for me, it's like, it's interesting, Tanisha, and I'd love for your guys' final thoughts on all this, but to bring all these narratives, what I think I love most about this conversation was that I was following a story. I was following someone's life, their background, where they came from, what the stakes were in their lives at different times, and how they changed and grew or had setbacks. I'm telling you, I couldn't even find, I only knew the two top fights tonight until maybe Sunday they announced the others. I know nothing about them. And actually, I don't even think that if I was an investigative reporter, I could learn, if I had all of the access I could on the FBI report. And, because they have so little actual fights and, history, I worry that what people are going to do, yes, they don't have live sports, but they're going to come on and be like, what is this? I don't know. Why do I care? And that's what concerns me. And just in terms of, I'd love, I'm going to turn it over to Tanisha and tell people where they can find you. But I really appreciate you coming in. This is, George Foreman is so lucky to have had you, curate his history, learn all of this. Sounds like you've met him a few times, and how special
We talked on the phone once a week for a couple of months, which was for him really generous, because this is a guy who still has a lot of media opportunities and obligations, right? And so I was grateful that he was willing to talk to me as many times as he did, so that I could kind of fill out all of the questions that I had and learn things that I never even knew to ask about. right? And
Yeah.
that's why we do that oral history component, whether they're famous people or not famous people. Those human stories are invaluable. Now, as a historian, I mean, I couldn't take them at face value, so I still had to spend a couple weeks at the Library of Congress trying to validate as many of those stories as I could. And it turns out his memory is really sharp for, now a 70-year-old who spent a lot of his life getting punched in the head. He's pretty close on a lot of things. So I was very fortunate to get a chance to talk to him to flesh out the book. That's for sure. And hopefully, other people will read it and figure out what things I missed and follow up and write the rest of what is a very long and still ongoing life history that definitely isn't going to be captured in one book.
I'm sure we've got another act for George Foreman.
Yeah, when I started the project, I really thought he had basically he was finished with public life, and then the Foreman Family Show comes on, and that wasn't that good. Anyone who watched it, but and then I said, okay, well now we're definitely not seeing a whole lot because he wasn't even doing much boxing commentary anymore. Then he gets on, the show with Shatner and Winkler and Bradshaw. And he gets a couple more years, finally gets a show renewed, gets a couple more years in the public eye, and the grill has never really gone away. So I was surprised that he kept resurfacing every time I thought, okay, this is it, and I can finally get down to business. And so now I've just reconciled that he will always be in the public eye because that's really what he has a knack for doing, whether it's getting paid or not. This is the guy who was still performing weddings at halftime of a USFL game, not for money, but because he got to be on TV, right? And so he will always find ways to capture our attention because I really think that's just naturally who he is. But that's also why he was so important to boxing. And to your point, if boxing had more of that, it might be a healthier sport.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Tanisha, any final thoughts, and where can we find you?
Yeah, I think genuine is what comes up to mind when you speak about Foreman in this act and how he has kind of evolved and has just always wanted to be there and liked and loved and to be a service to his community, whether he's getting paid or not. I think it's just such an authentic, genuine thing that it might be lost, or we just don't see those stories. And it's such an important part of not only just American history, boxing history, but just the human experience. I just love discovering and diving into those types of stories because, we've been telling stories since before the wheel, right? Like we always have different means of looking back at how civilization and society has worked. And so that's why I'm always marveled at looking at the history of certain individuals in the context of their environment and upbringing, and I'm always able to find a connection to today, and I'm always able to find instances of how this is related to a larger picture. And yeah, I can't wait to dive into and read your book this summer. It's on my queue. I know I'm gonna dive into it and not stop when I put it down, or when I pick it up. I'm not gonna put it down. But yeah, so and thank you. I'm so glad that George was able to have you as this conduit to sharing this experience and using your perspectives of U.S. history and literature to be able to tell this story in such an authentic and genuine way, because it's warranted. It's a certainly warranted aspect of global history. It's huge and can't be understated. And so, yeah, and thank you so much for being here. And for me, I mean, I don't do much, but I am on Twitter a lot, always live tweeting sports and randomly tweeting some I don't know, academic gems, but I'm kind of all over the place. But it's at T Singleton Says on Twitter, and find me, email me up from my website, TanishaSingleton.com. And yeah, more coming in the Writing and Fighting series with me and Nancy for sure.
I look forward to reading and listening for sure, and love to hear what you think of the book when you do get into it.
Absolutely.
And thank you. And Andrew, you're on Twitter.
I am at Andrew RM Smith on Twitter, probably not posting as much as I should be, but definitely digesting and trying to be part of any conversation that I can.
Well, great. Well, we hope you come back, because
anytime I would be happy to.
Yes, I love it. And so you say that you're continuing always work on the Foreman Chronicle. Are there any other stories or projects that you
Yeah, now that this is finally out and finished, I've started working on project Malcolm Flash Gordon, who was kind of like a citizen sports writer, like a self-publishing boxing writer from the late 60s through the early 80s, and broke a couple of boxing's biggest scandals, but hasn't really been considered much in his own right as kind of this, muckraker of boxing, mimeographing his own program out of his bathtub in Queens and selling it at fights in New York and Philadelphia. So I think there's a lot to say about, how boxing writing was evolving and how citizen journalism in that pre-internet era, now everyone really has the tools to be a citizen journalist if they want to. But in that era, it was definitely a lot harder to be heard if you didn't have credentials. And he really did that and broke that barrier and made boxing, better. I mean, he at least shone some lights in some dark places that needed attention. So that's what I'm working on right now. And there are so many stories between boxing, wrestling, and the history of sports in the United States that need to be told. And hopefully I'll get a chance to write a few of them.
Oh, great. Well, you have to come back because you're talking about our jams here.
Yeah.
Good, good.
The wrestling, I always like breaking the scandals too. So please, you'll have to join us.
No shortage of work.
What was that?
Yep.
No shortage of work.
No shortage of work.
Definitely.
Yes. So thank you all. I'm on Twitter at Nancy Ann Kidder, and then writeandfight.com. It has my syllabus that I'm working on. But thank you, Andrew. And again, yes, no way but to fight George Foreman and the business of boxing. I will put this on Twitter, the link, and please, yes, it's fascinating.
Super. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
I think the fight's still going on.
Yeah, catch the last rounds.
Probably have sleep and other, duties. But
Possibly. I'll check the round by rounds.
yeah. Well, thank you, and until next time.
Absolutely. Thank you both. Stay healthy. Be well.
Thanks.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.